Well, this is very exciting. This is our first public event as an organization since the board recovered a quorum in October, and really in more than 2 years. And so this is a milestone in our pursuit of the board's statutory mission of pursuing transparency. We're delighted to revive the board's past practice, which was very valuable to its work, but it did have a quorum of holding regular public events to inform the public about its work. Transparency is a core part of the board's mission. I alluded to the board statute, which requires transparency from us. We take that very seriously, and we hope to achieve it in 3 ways. The first is informing the public about our work. So far, we've issued the board's first semi-annual report in 2 years. We're going to keep those going, obviously, and we will soon issue a strategic plan laying out milestones for the board's next 4 years. The second is informing the public about issues within our jurisdiction. Ideally, that will mean that many of our oversight reports, although not all, can eventually be released to the public in unclassified form. In addition, we recently issued the board's first semi-annual report, as I already said, which is available on our website, and that contains information about the board's activities during the sub-quorum period. So if you haven't read that, I think we have copies here today, and it's also available on our website. The third aspect, and this is why we're here today, is for us to learn from the public and from outside experts, and we have a great selection of those who will be speaking later. The input that we get today will inform our agenda as we decide what oversight projects to pursue in the years to come. We'll hear from experts in privacy, civil liberties, technology, and national security. And then all of you in attendance, and we're very grateful that you're here, will have an opportunity to pose questions of the panelists and offer suggestions for us as we form our oversight agenda. This first public event in more than 2 years is also an opportunity to acknowledge those who have contributed to the board in the past. We're very grateful for all that they have done to establish the board's legacy. That includes the previous generation of board members, Chairman David Medine, Rachel Brand, Beth Collins, James Dempsey, and Judge Pat Walls. It also includes the board's previous executive director, Sharon Bradford Franklin, and also other past and present members of the board staff for the legacy of rigor and quality that their work left to us and that we take very seriously and we want to preserve and enhance. In particular, I want to acknowledge the career and accomplishments of Judge Wald, who is a legend in the law and unfortunately passed away last month. Her contributions to the board were considerable and will form an enduring part of the agency's legacy. And we're also grateful for those who participated in previous iterations of the board before Congress established us as an independent federal agency in 2007. Finally, I want to particularly thank board member Beth Collins, former board member Beth Collins, and the staff members who guided the board through the sub-quorum period that lasted for more than a year and a half. They had considerable accomplishments during that time, despite the institutional challenges that the sub-quorum period imposed. Those accomplishments are described in the semi-annual report I mentioned earlier. Board member Collins and those staff members have left the board in a strong position to carry forward our mission with a renewed quorum, and we're very thankful for that. I'm very pleased personally to be part of this group of new board members, and I'm very excited to work with our excellent staff and with my new colleagues. So with that, I'll turn to my colleagues for their opening remarks. Ed Felton.
Thanks. First, I want to join the chairman in thanks to all of those who have helped put the board in the position that we're in today, and especially to Beth Collins and the staff who guided us through the sub-quorum period. I'd like to talk briefly this morning about how the board does its work and about the role of technology, expertise, and analysis in the board's work. The board has 2 main functions, advice and oversight. Under the advice function, executive branch agencies can consult with the board at an early stage in the development of new programs, policies, guidelines, and regulations to ensure that privacy and civil liberties protections are factored into their design. An advice engagement allows agencies to get an independent assessment of potential privacy and civil liberties issues in the development of new programs. And of course, this works best when agencies come to us early in their process for advice. Under the oversight function, the board engages in in-depth reviews. The board has briefings from agency representatives, reviews documents, and ultimately produces reports and recommendations. Those reports and recommendations are published publicly to the extent possible, consistent with protection of classified information. Some of the reports are necessarily classified in nature. Speaking for myself, I'm especially interested in understanding how changes in technology are affecting intelligence and law enforcement, counterterrorism, and privacy and civil liberties. I know that my fellow board members share my belief that the board's work must be fully informed on these technology issues. The discourse on technology and privacy is often a purely negative one. Technology does create new privacy challenges, but technology also creates opportunities to do better. Technology, if used appropriately, can reduce the privacy impact of some analytic programs, and technology can help to ensure compliance with laws and best practices. In the discourse about privacy, civil liberties, and technology, it's important not to miss the opportunities that technology provides. Choices that are made in the technical implementation of a program or activity can have profound implications for the efficiency, effectiveness of the program, as well as the impact on privacy and civil liberties. The success of the PCLOB as an agency will continue to require work that relies on expert understanding of technology and integrates that technical work with expertise in counterterrorism, privacy, civil liberties, law, and policy. We'll continue to build capacity in all of these areas. I look forward to the information and perspectives that we'll hear today, and I thank our panelists and everyone else who will bring us input today.
Thanks, Ed. And Janie?
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone, first of all, for joining us today and for bearing with me as I'm sort of beamed in from afar. I'm truly sorry that I could not be there in person, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the panelists and from other folks today. I first wanted to just begin by joining my colleagues and thanking former members of the board as well as former and current staff for doing all the work they've done before to allow the board to be so functional already as we regained our quorum a couple months ago. I want to use my time just to say a few words about the rule of law and how it intersects with PCLOB's mission, and more specifically to remark on how the board's mission, I think, furthers the broader goal that all of us share a government that adheres to the rule of law. I think that foremost, when thinking about a rule of law, it's important to recognize that the rule of law is not achieved simply because the government conforms to the law in some technical sense. So simply because the government actor adheres to what someone says is the law does not in and of itself mean that they govern under the rule of law. So there are a number of conditions that must be satisfied in order to have a rule of law, but two of them seem to me particularly useful to discuss when thinking about the national security space. So first and foremost is that the rules under which the government operates, so the rules that constrain the government, have to be knowable beforehand by the public to the greatest extent possible. And this is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is to allow for accountability and democratic legitimacy. Of course, it's not possible to be fully transparent oftentimes in the space given legitimate classification concerns, but at a minimum, it's important not to have a complete mismatch between the rules the public understands the government to be bound by and the rules that the government, in fact, considers itself to be bound by. Second, I think it's important to the rule of law that the rules do not permit wildly discretionary action by the government. So again, this is for a variety of reasons. One, those to ensure roughly equal treatment of equally situated persons by the government so that people cannot be singled out for illegitimate reasons. Now, there are a lot of actors within the government working towards these rule of law principles, and we'll of course hear from one of those shortly. Those actors are critical to the endeavor. What PCLOB can bring to the table is unique perspective that it offers by sitting as an outsider. So it can offer an independent outsider's perspective on the government activities and some of the questions raised by the rule of law principles. So for example, as an outsider, it may be best situated to consider whether the public's understanding of the law roughly tracks the government's own understanding and application. So I will leave it there and will simply say again, I very much look forward to hearing from our panelists and from other members of the public today. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Janie. I'd like to call up our first expert, who's Alex Joel, who is known to many of you in the audience, based on the faces I see out there. Mr. Joel serves as the Chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is a post he's held since 2005. He has previous career experience as an officer in the Army's JAG Corps, as a lawyer in private practice, and in the Office of General Counsel at the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Joel, thank you for joining us today. Based on my own experience as an outside researcher at a think tank before joining the board, I can say that many people outside of government, including researchers, interest groups, journalists, even legislators and their staff, have benefited and indeed rely on the work done by your office and others in the intelligence community, especially the civil liberties and privacy officers, in providing greater transparency consistent with the need to protect sources and methods, of course. Some of that work responded to past recommendations by the board, many of which were enacted by the USA Freedom Act. Some of them were undertaken by the intelligence community of its own volition. And I think all of them, in all of these respects, responsible transparency strengthens democratic accountability, as Janie suggested, and ultimately reinforces the foundation of public legitimacy on which these authorities rest. So we thank you and your colleagues for those efforts, and we look forward to working with you to strengthen them and advance them further in the years ahead.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the invitation to come and address you, and it's terrific to see so many faces in the audience here. So I think that's a great sign of the interest in the board and in what you are set out to do. My colleagues and I are delighted that the board has a forum, and we very much look forward to working with you again. I'm here to provide a few remarks to set the context, at least to provide some information about the context in which the board's oversight and advice functions will operate from the intelligence community's perspective. Obviously, there are other pieces of the context that will be provided by others. I personally have been in this job since 2005. I've therefore had the privilege of working with the board beginning with its first iteration. You've been talking about different iterations of the board when it was part of the Executive Office of the President, and then with its second iteration as a standalone independent agency. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to work with the three of you and your staff, and also working with the two remaining board members once they're confirmed. The board's mandate, as you pointed out, is to provide advice and oversight with respect to the government's efforts to keep the nation safe from terrorism. Because it's important to understand the broader context in which our counterterrorism operations and activities function, which is what the board will be reviewing, I wanted to take a few minutes to describe the current terrorist threat environment. In that regard, as you know, the National Counterterrorism Center has been providing detailed classified threat briefings to the board and looks forward to continuing those briefings going forward. At the outset, I want to note that the intelligence community's mission is to focus on national security and to provide the best foreign intelligence we can. That means that as it regards terrorism, we focus on international terrorism, including how foreign terrorist organizations reach inside the United States to carry out their goals. There are, of course, very significant domestic threats that are unrelated to international terrorism, and those threats are the focus of other government organizations, and is not what I will talk about today. So with that in mind, as many of you know, Director Coates recently appeared before Congress along with other IC leaders to provide the annual worldwide threat assessment. I think this is an extraordinarily display of public transparency, which the IC has been doing for quite some time. That assessment covered a range of threats, not just terrorism. As Director Coates said, the composition of the current threats we face is a toxic mix of strategic competitors, regional powers, weak or failed states, and non-state actors, all using a variety of tools in overt and subtle ways to achieve their goals. He pointed out that the scale and scope of the various threats facing the U.S. and our immediate interests worldwide is likely to further intensify this year. And a lot of his talk before Congress was about that whole range of complex threats. Regarding terrorism specifically, Director Coates said that it remains a persistent threat, and in some ways is positioned to increase in 2019. The conflicts in Iraq and Syria have generated a large pool of skilled and battle-hardened fighters who remain dispersed throughout the region. While ISIS is nearing territorial defeat in Iraq and Syria, the group has returned to its guerrilla warfare roots, while continuing to plan attacks and direct its supporters worldwide. ISIS is intent on resurging and still commands thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria. ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups also continue to try to motivate U.S.-based supporters to carry out acts of violence in the United States to further their terrorist goals. Note that although there continue to be attacks in Europe and the United States, most attacks take place in countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and most victims of those attacks are residents of those countries. The IC works closely with partners as part of an ongoing collaborative effort to combat terrorism worldwide. The IC has also warned that violent ethno-supremacist and ultranationalist groups in Europe will employ violent tactics in pursuit of their aims. In the past 2 years, individuals with ties to violent ethno-supremacist groups in France, Sweden, and the United Kingdom have either carried out attacks on minorities and politicians or had their plots disrupted by authorities. And interestingly, in terms of newer technologies, the IC has warned that terrorists could obtain and disclose compromising or personally identifiable information through cyber operations, and that they may use such disclosures to coerce, extort, or to inspire and enable physical attacks against their victims. So that's just a brief snapshot of some of the threats that the IC's counterterrorism programs and activities are designed to address. And as I said before, NCTC stands ready to provide more detailed information to the board, including, of course, classified information as part of its regular threat briefings. Another part of the strategic context for our programs is the recently issued National Intelligence Strategy, or NIS, which for listeners at home, I'm holding up a copy of. This is the fourth iteration of the NIS, and it establishes 7 mission objectives and 7 enterprise objectives. The mission objectives broadly describe the activities and outcomes necessary for the IC to carry out its mission, and the enterprise objectives provide the foundation for how those mission capabilities and business functions will be developed and carried out. There is a standalone mission objective for counterterrorism, Mission Objective 5, a version of which, not surprisingly, has been in all iterations of the NIS. That objective states that the IC will identify, understand, monitor, and disrupt state and non-state actors engaged in terrorism and related activities. The IC has been aggressively pursuing counterterrorism for many years, that's no surprise to anyone, and intends to continue to do so. And of course, again, we stand ready to brief the board on those specific programs and activities as part of the board's oversight function and to seek advice as new programs are contemplated. One of the reasons I refer to the National Intelligence Strategy is because for the first time, there is also a standalone enterprise objective in the NIS, Enterprise Objective 7, which states that the IC will safeguard privacy and civil liberties and practice appropriate transparency to enhance accountability and public trust in all we do. This is, in my view, a very significant step, and again, one that is new for this version of the National Intelligence Strategy. In the prior version, and in prior versions, of course, there were references to the need to protect privacy and civil liberties, but now it's a standalone enterprise objective, which is highly meaningful in terms of how the intelligence community organizes and conducts its activities. That objective, privacy, civil liberties, and transparency, has 3 sub-objectives. The first looks inward to the IC and calls upon us to incorporate privacy and civil liberties safeguards in our policies, programs, and activities. The second looks to oversight entities and to our partners and calls on us to make sure that those oversight entities have the information they need to carry out rigorous oversight. These first 2 sub-objectives reflect the 2 traditional pillars of our framework: rules to protect civil liberties and privacy, and oversight to ensure we follow those rules. Now, traditionally, as we know, those vital processes and functions have taken place behind closed doors. And this type of secret oversight, in my view, is absolutely essential to a democracy. If the oversight entities don't have access to the classified information that really describes what the intelligence community is actually doing, they cannot hold us accountable for our activities. So they must have classified information. Their oversight in that sense must be quote unquote secret. But what we've learned over the last few years is that having a robust rules and oversight framework, as much as it may need monitoring and adjustment and improvement, that those measures are necessary but not sufficient in terms of earning and retaining public trust. That's where our third sub-objective comes in. So the first looks inside the IC, and the second looks to our oversight bodies and our partners. The third looks out to the public and calls on us to provide transparency. The public must be able to understand who we are, what we do, what our rules are, and how we ensure compliance with those rules while still protecting sources and methods. A few years ago, we issued the Principles of Intelligence Transparency for the IC. These are high-level principles that give us guidance and direction. They are also included in the NIS. The IC followed up on those principles by establishing an implementation plan, forming an Intelligence Transparency Council, and taking a range of concrete measures to live up to those principles. The IC established IC on the Record on Tumblr as a platform for publishing an extraordinary volume of formally classified information documenting how we use key national security authorities such as 702 of FISA. The IC also prepared and published key reports and worked closely with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to support their ability to be completely transparent with their reports on this topic on two key national security authorities. We have also published our semi-annual assessments of compliance under Section 702 and an annual statistical transparency report, which provides a range of statistics on how the IC uses important national security authorities. Interestingly, about that annual statistical transparency report, the first two that we published were proactively done pursuant to our principles of transparency. Congress obviously liked the reports and codified doing that annual statistical transparency report into law. So that became a legal requirement. The last three have been done pursuant to that legal requirement. We also included some additional statistics in those reports that the three reports that were under the new statutory requirement that were not required by the law. Congress liked those additional statistics and codified those statistics into the requirement going forward. So we're still going to find other ways to be proactively transparent beyond what Congress has required. In addition, we launched intelligence.gov. I hope you guys have had a chance to look at it. It's a digital front door to the intelligence community. Very unlike a government website in my view, featuring rich multimedia content and innovative approaches to conveying information. It also serves as a platform to host major repositories of documents such as Bin Laden's bookshelf and the recently released documents that we've put out there in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. In addition, we've taken all the documents posed on IC on the record and made them full text searchable through a search feature on intelligence.gov. This is a significant aid to researchers and journalists and others who want to dive deep into the documents and see what's there. We're not trying to hide them behind opaque scanned PDF files. They are now OCR and full text searchable. And we're trying to do that same process for additional document repositories that we have out there. It takes time and effort, unfortunately, but we're working on it. In March of last year, Director Coates reissued our Core Intelligence Community Directive, ICD 107. It was first issued in 2012 and focused on civil liberties and privacy. Under Director Coates, it's been revised, so it now includes transparency as well. And as I mentioned before, transparency is now part of the National Intelligence Strategy, which sets direction for the entire community. So we see the rapid evolution of transparency in the intelligence community, from high-level principles to concrete action to mandatory policy, and now forming an integral part of our strategy as a community for the next 5 years. Our commitment is reflected in other ways as well, and I believe it is really becoming ingrained in the culture of the intelligence community. For example, we have the Principles of Professional Ethics, which we issued in 2012, and we give to new entrants as this is called a badge buddy. It's also reflected in the National Intelligence Strategy. It calls on us to selflessly serve the American people, seek and speak the truth, respect privacy and civil liberties, demonstrate integrity in our conduct, and to be accountable and seek continuous improvement, and to embrace the diversity of our nation. There's a little bit more text on that than that, but those are the core principles. On Constitution Day, at the ODNI, we retake our oath to support and defend the Constitution, to remind us what we're here to do, and other IC elements hold similar events to reaffirm their oaths. My counterparts across the IC also provide innovative training on the comprehensive rules that are in place to protect civil liberties and privacy in order to further reinforce that culture. In addition, one of the things we try to do is establish a safe place for people to raise any concerns and questions they have among the workforce. I have held many what I call plain talk sessions with the workforce, both in person and online, where anyone can ask me any question related to civil liberties, privacy, and transparency, and I will do my best to answer it directly to the extent there is knowledge in my head about it. We have also held a series of panels in agency forums and interagency forums to make sure people understand the various channels available to raise concerns. And in particular, I want to point out the intelligence community's Inspector General community has really stepped up its training and awareness, as well as its public footprint. If you haven't gone to oversight.gov or any of the IG websites, I encourage you to do so. You'll see a wealth of information about the IGs, their reports, and whistleblower protections, and the whistleblower process and the process for making complaints. I strongly support, we all strongly support those efforts. And of course, the inspectors general take their job very seriously and rigorously investigate retaliation claims and whistleblower protections. As I think you can tell, I feel we've accomplished a great deal, and I am very proud of those accomplishments. But I know there is a lot more work ahead of us, and we welcome the board's advice and oversight in that regard. So, looking ahead, I would just want to mention a few items that I think the board might want to take an interest in, or might have an interest in. I've mentioned already the annual statistical transparency report. The 6th one is coming up with an April deadline. These reports are very important and very difficult to prepare. There's a lot of complex information in those reports. We're always looking for ways to make those reports more understandable and for ways to make sure that we are satisfying the requests for the additional granularity in the statistics, which can be very difficult for us to do. So we stand ready to brief the board on those reports, including the classified information that supports them, and discuss what they say about our use of national security authorities. Of course, many people here know USA Freedom Act. Certain provisions of that act are set to expire at the end of this year. We will be working on transparency to support the public debate on those provisions, and in particular, there is one provision that authorizes the government to obtain call detail records on a targeted basis from telecommunications companies with individualized court orders from the FISA court. We expect to spend quite a bit of time on that provision, and we welcome including the board in either its advice or oversight function. I'm glad that the board has also taken an interest in technology, of course. The intelligence community has publicly discussed its strong interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning to support the work of our intelligence analysts. We're keenly aware of the privacy and civil liberties concerns associated with the development and deployment of those technologies and look forward to the board taking a role in that. More generally, technology is changing ever more rapidly, while law and policy changes change more slowly, sometimes leaving a gap in terms of how what I call old rules apply to new tools, something that board members have already brought up. And just as the board members have mentioned, we are interested in not only the risks presented by new technologies, and the benefits they have for the intelligence analysis, but we also are interested in how those technologies might be used to further privacy protections and enhance transparency. On the international front, as you know, some of our friends overseas have expressed concerns about how intelligence community agencies protect privacy. We have done, in my view, a great deal of work to address those concerns and have made substantial and in some cases dramatic progress. Nonetheless, it's an ongoing conversation and we would welcome the board's engagement in that area. Finally, we will continue to look for ways to improve our current transparency practices and develop new ones. The IC faces growing transparency demands, both from our own proactive efforts and from external mandates, including ever-increasing FOIA litigation. We have limited resources. Much of this work requires the in-depth involvement of the intelligence experts who are themselves conducting the activities about which we're trying to be transparent. So we are pulling them away from their intelligence mission in order to help us figure out how to make more information public about what they're doing. And it's really only with their expertise that we can properly conduct the painstaking line-by-line reviews that we need to do in order to make any document public. Nonetheless, even with these constraints, we know there is more we can be doing and that we should be doing, and we welcome the board's expertise and insight as we continue to look for ways to improve our transparency efforts. So, again, thank you for this opportunity to speak. We look forward to working with the board and as it carries out its vital advisory and oversight functions. I'll stay here for the question and answer period in case the public has questions. I think you guys...
Thank you, Alex. That was great. We really appreciate your joining us. Just a note on the choreography of the event. The board members will now ask Alex a few questions. He'll then sit down. We'll come up to rejoin the second panel, and we'll have a lengthy period for audience questions for all of the panelists, just to simplify things. We'll go to Janie for the first board question.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex, for that. That was great. I wonder actually if you could just speak to how oversight entities in particular can avoid following so-called cycles of timidity and aggression when scrutinizing the intelligence community's activities. So sort of how does one ensure that after perhaps a lull in known and public terrorist activity, that oversight is conducted responsibly?
Cycles of timidity and aggression. I like that. So I won't purport to give you guys advice. I know that from our end, what's really important is making sure that we provide you information that you ask for, and that if we can't get you that information, that we explain to you why that is. My own personal experience, having had to conduct oversight from an internal perspective in my role, and of course working over many years with different oversight entities, is that the worst thing an agency that's being overseen can do is to appear to be withholding information, deliberately withholding information from an oversight entity. So I hope we never appear to be doing that. And in order, one of the things that we can do to avoid the occurrence is ensure that we have good communication channels so that we can explain to you if we're having trouble producing information, why it is, and not generate a cycle of, not kick off a cycle of aggression as the oversight entity tries to, feels that it's being stiff-armed and is trying to get that information from us.
Fair enough, thank you.
And on your end, I would ask for patience.
You mentioned the disparity sometimes between the rate of change of technology versus the rate of change in law and policy, the old rules, new tools issue. And of course, sometimes the old rules continue to do the job well, even as the tools change. But how might we approach that challenge broadly? How might we go about trying to understand where the tension between old rules and new tools requires attention, where there's friction happening, and versus where, even though tools are changing, the old rules are functioning well.
Right. So, I mean, a classic example of an old rule is the Constitution. I think it's functioning extremely well. We don't need an amendment to address, each new twist of social media gadgetry that gets out there. So I guess I'd say a couple of things. One is to go back to the point made earlier about transparency in terms of the legal framework and understanding that the government has versus what the public has in terms of how rules apply in different situations. I think some of the biggest, most dramatic problems we've faced in the past, in the recent past, has been this mismatch between what the government has gone through a deliberate process internally to interpret and apply to a particular program, and how the public understands the same legal and statutory provision. It's an old rule. It's been worked very carefully by lawyers on the inside to make it apply to a new situation, but that new application and the work behind it has not been adequately made public. And so that is an area that I think is absolutely important as we look to figure out ways to apply new rules, old rules to new tools. I think it's very difficult to do, but I think we've already gotten better at it, and we obviously have more work to do in that regard, because a lot of times the legal analysis is really closely tied up with the facts, and the facts are still classified. I think another thought that I have when you mention that is I do worry when we feel like there's so much of a gap that we do have to go and institute a change to the law. I think it's appropriate. We have to be selective about when we do that, because I think once you start the policy and lawmaking process, that again, it moves slowly. It can take years. The people in that process can misunderstand the technology, or the technology, once they understand it, may have changed during the 3 years of deliberation it's taking to come up with these, amendments. And so now you're stuck with newer rules, but still a mismatch between those rules and the technology. But now everybody's been exhausted by this policy process, and they don't want to keep taking it up again. So somehow we have to figure out, when we do make adjustments, to make them in a way that is flexible enough to accommodate changes in technology. And I think the third is really incumbent on all of us, which is, and it's something that I've mentioned before, one of the mission objectives of the National Intelligence Strategy is anticipatory intelligence. So this is something intelligence analysts and the intelligence community focuses on. Like, how do we anticipate? Let's look down, strategic warning, look down the pipe. Well, I think that concept can apply to us in this field. Like, we need to look down the pike. We see a Supreme Court ruling, and it establishes something that is potentially game-changing, but it hasn't been applied broader than those set of facts. We know that technologies can change it. We can see changes down the road. We need to be anticipating what those changes are and figuring out how to adjust what we're doing, not dramatically because the rules haven't changed yet, perhaps, but in anticipation of what would happen if they did catch up with things. So I think this concept of anticipatory intelligence is what really the board can really help us out a lot on.
You talked about statistical transparency, which is something that I think is very important in giving the public a general sense of the scale of certain activities while keeping the details necessarily secret. And those reports, which your office issues, I found to be incredibly useful. I think they're very valuable for specialists in the field, researchers, journalists. While they're not necessarily an easy read for an ordinary member of the public, they are very valuable for those interlocutors who communicate these things to the public. So I'm very grateful to your office for doing them. Of course, part of our job is to look for further opportunities for transparency. In that vein, how does your office and your colleagues in the intelligence community evaluate new proposals and new opportunities for statistical transparency in terms of feasibility and in terms of potential value to the public of a particular data point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're always looking. The issue comes up frequently. Well, not frequently, but an issue comes up every time we're working on our new statistical transparency report. And I'm looking at some of my colleagues from the agencies that do the hard work on those statistics. We gather them and present them, but my colleagues at the agencies are the ones that really are in the trenches figuring out what these statistics mean and how to gather them and making sure that they are accurate. Feasibility is an important thing. We do want to, a constraint that we face is that the technology that has been put in place over decades of different intelligence agencies and the new technologies that they're evaluating are, one would logically understand and expect, focus on the core intelligence mission, counterterrorism, anticipatory intelligence, all those mission objectives. One of the things that we're trying to now focus on, and we will be able to better, I think, with the enterprise objective on privacy and transparency and the intelligence community directive on transparency and the principles and their track record, is to think about how technology can aid us in calculating and counting some of the statistics. It's hard for us to predict which statistics are going to be the most interesting and useful and important and relevant, so that's another area. Sometimes to people inside the intelligence community, they don't understand the value of counting a certain number. And they say, well, this number is irrelevant to us in terms of how we do our work. Why is it such a big deal to the public? So we want to figure out which numbers convey useful information about how we are using these authorities. It goes back to Jamie's point earlier, which is, I think that a statistic that either confirms or belies government statements about how it's used a particular authority are helpful. Like, you want to be able to provide statistics with the appropriate context that the public can look at and they say, oh, well, they say they use this very rarely. The statistical report says they used it 5 times. Okay, so they're using it very rarely. Or they say they're using it very rarely. The statistical report says that they've used it 5 billion times. That doesn't seem rare, to me. So those kinds of statistics, I think, are important. And if people wanted to propose to us different statistics, it would be helpful if they explain how it would be important in that regard, as opposed to, I just want more numbers. And that's another problem we face with transparency, and I called it the cookie monster problem. So the cookie monster is never satisfied. It's always going to want more cookies. Transparency is never, there's no destination unless you are completely transparent, and therefore your intelligence agencies are out of business. So there will always be more information. I give you one report, not you personally, but we issue one report, they want the report cited in footnote 3. Give them the report cited in footnote 3, they want the redacted versions of that report, they want other reports alluded to, so it just is a never-ending chain. And we face significant FOIA requests and litigation. Those requests have been going up substantially. I hope it's not driven by our transparency efforts, but those FOIA requests, important to satisfy, are also creating this resource load on our folks, and it's become very difficult. That was kind of a rambling answer to your question, but I hope I got to some of it.
Certainly. I'm happy to go again, unless anyone wants to step in. I wholeheartedly agree with Janie's comments about the dangers of a gap between what the public thinks the government can do and what the government thinks the government can do. And I think the board's 215 report demonstrated why those gaps can be so dangerous and corrosive for democratic accountability, and ultimately harmful to your colleagues in the intelligence community when the public loses trust in public statements. And I'm appreciative of the work that's been done since then, partially because of the USA Freedom Act, partially on the community's own initiative to eliminate potential gaps in understanding. One example is the declassification of FISA court opinions, which is a good thing, again, for journalists, for researchers, for members of the public, for lawyers, enhances public understanding of how the law is being interpreted in a classified context. Can you talk about some other things that your office is doing and things that you encourage intelligence community agencies, and particularly lawyers who are interpreting the law within those agencies, to do to avoid the emergence of such gaps between public understanding and classified interpretation?
So, I think the easiest thing is to focus on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court opinions. I think one of my colleagues pointed out that those opinions, I think if you track them over time, there's fewer redactions as they come out, in part because of all the information we've declassified about the subject matter of those opinions, but I also believe in part because of how they're prepared at the outset. I think if you have in mind that you're working on a document that will be entirely classified and will never see the light of day, you're going to freely intermix classified facts and unclassified facts. We already have had a lot of work done in the intelligence community to try to get analysts to change how they do that, to right to release, right to the lowest level of classification so that the information can be disseminated. We've added transparency to those directives so that they are also thinking of not only disseminating something at lower levels of classification so that it can go broader in the US government, but also about what can be actually written at an unclassified level. I think I hope that the awareness has risen to the point where lawyers and others writing those kinds of documents are now also thinking about transparency and about how to write something in a way where the legal analysis can stand separate from a discussion of classified program details. But we're still working on that. I'm not going to suggest that we have reached any sort of magic bullet answer. It's a work that remains in progress.
Janie?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in here. One comment, actually, before I get to the question. I think that's a great point that you raised, because I recall that when I was reading FISC opinions in a classified setting, so with no redactions, they were not like opinions by other Article 3 courts that were written for public consumption, and so they often assumed a background understanding of facts that had come before. And I think that now actors understanding that some opinions or other documents may eventually be released for public consumption can make them more easily consumable once they are released. My question is actually, and I think your answer may go back to your Cookie Monster analogy, but having now worked over the years with advocacy groups and the broader public, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to the reaction that you've seen by these entities to the transparency push that your office and other members of the IC have done in the wake of the Snowden leaks, and specifically to talk to whether you think some of the loss of trust in the IC has been repaired by the transparency push.
I want to believe that we've made progress in public trust. We haven't, of course, we don't do polling on that, and it would be hard to do that. And I think one of the issues we have, and we're addressing in different ways, is that we can put out volumes of information, but that doesn't mean anyone other than specific interested researchers and experts will ever read it. So we've tried to find different ways to make the information more accessible to the public. Well, one of the things we've done is met a lot with advocacy organizations, some of whom I see in this room. So I like to think that we've built up a certain important and trusted relationship within the confines of that particular set of engagements. I'm not suggesting that they trust the intelligence community writ large all of a sudden and are aching to join us, but rather that it is that there has been some trust established and built in terms of the integrity with which we approach our obligations to try to make information transparent. That said, we still have more work to do. It's hard to fully establish trust if you're keeping certain things secret, just as a general rule, right? Anything like that always breeds suspicion. So we're always looking for ways to continue that road. But I do think that the transparency work we've done, in my view, and I'm biased, and I think that many of my colleagues from other agencies in here share my bias, but I think it's been groundbreaking. And it's been certainly extraordinary in my own experience of having been in the intelligence community now for 17 years. I say that slowly, thinking, oh my gosh. Yeah, so it's a unique point, I think, in the intelligence community's history, and the fact that it's in the National Intelligence Strategy as a standalone enterprise objective is very significant. I know that it raised not a ripple necessarily in the public's mind, who don't even know, haven't followed the National Intelligence Strategy as closely as we have, but for us it is a very significant development.
Thank you, Alex. And I think that's a great opportunity to segue to get some outside views on these challenges. Alex will come back later, as I said, and take questions from the public. So now we'll call up our second set of panelists. We'll have a brief 2-minute interlude as we reset the table, and our second set of panelists come and take their places. You want to hold me, please, sir? The interlude was shorter than 2 minutes, which I think is a hopeful sign for the future of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. So I'll now introduce the second set of board members in alphabetical order, and then we will go in reverse alphabetical order with their names. So get ready. Alex Abdo is a senior staff attorney at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, and he previously held the same role at the ACLU. He has litigated many significant cases relating to surveillance, encryption, transparency, and other pressing national security and privacy issues. Chris Calabrese is the Vice President for Policy at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He has long experience working on issues related to privacy, government surveillance, fostering the responsible use of new technologies, and other relevant issues. He previously worked on those issues in the Washington Legislative Office of the ACLU, so we have 2 ACLU alumni here today. Carrie Cordero, my former colleague incidentally, is the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow and General Counsel at the Center for a New American Security, and an expert on the intelligence community, oversight, transparency, surveillance, and national security law. She previously worked on these issues in various capacities inside the government, including in the Department of Justice and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And finally, Jason Matheny is a commissioner on the National Security Commission on AI, Artificial Intelligence, created by Congress in 2018. Previously, he was Assistant Director of National Intelligence and Director of IARPA, which is responsible for the development of breakthrough technologies for the U.S. intelligence community, along with many other affiliations and distinctions too numerous to list here. So we will now hear opening remarks from each expert, and we'll start with Jason Matheny.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I'm going to spend a few minutes surveying emerging technologies that are likely to affect privacy in the next 2 decades, and that might be relevant to the board's work. I'll begin by listing some emerging technologies likely to reduce some aspects of privacy. These include increasingly accurate biometric systems that can identify individuals from images of the face or recordings of the voice, de-anonymization techniques that can identify individuals by efficiently combining increasingly large volumes of digital data, techniques such as model inversion and membership attacks that can infer the properties of data from machine learning models that were trained on those data. For instance, a membership attack can reveal whether a facial recognition system was trained on a specific individual's face. The proliferation of network devices as part of the Internet of Things, and in particular in the next 2 decades, trillions of devices ranging from appliances to clothing are expected to be connected to the Internet. If data from those devices are not sufficiently secure, they could be used to reveal the identities and patterns of life of users. Finally, and most distantly, quantum computers could be used to defeat many existing encryption methods. This is unlikely to happen in the next 2 decades, but given the time that it takes to implement new encryption systems, NIST is currently evaluating new encryption methods that would be secure against future quantum computers. There are also many new emerging technologies likely to enhance privacy in the next 2 decades. I'll mention some of those, many of which involve advances in encryption. These include homomorphic encryption, which allows mathematical operations to be performed on encrypted data without first decrypting it. So for example, Alice could own a database of health records that are encrypted while still allowing Bob to calculate the number of patients in those records who have the flu without Alice's data being decrypted first. IARPA has worked with the Department of Homeland Security on a pilot project called SPAR to demonstrate that such methods are practical. Existing systems are inefficient, that is, they take more compute time than is typical for, say, running queries or running tabulations. But for problems that involve only thousands or even low millions of records, these systems can be used today for a range of applications that I'll mention later. Other advances in encryption include secure multi-party computation, in which Alice and Bob jointly perform a computation such as tallying election results while keeping their own data sets private. Functional encryption, in which Alice gives a key to Bob so that Bob can perform a computation on encrypted data, but Bob can only perform the computation that Alice has authorized. We're going to be getting to know Alice and Bob really well today. Verifiable computing, to prove to Alice that a computation Bob claimed to have done was done correctly. Zero knowledge proofs, in which Alice proves to Bob that she knows a secret, such as a password, without having to give up that secret. Differential privacy, in which controlled noise can be added to Alice's data so that individual information cannot be extracted. And lastly, new AI methods that are being developed to learn from encrypted data, a topic that's being pursued in IARPA's SAIL program, among others. Such methods would allow us to find patterns in large data sets, such as the causes of cancer from patterns in health records, without needing researchers to decrypt the records. So those are several emerging technologies likely to enhance privacy, and I'd like to make one recommendation to the board, which is to encourage more demonstration projects for federal agencies to use homomorphic encryption. Policymakers often have to make difficult trade-offs between privacy and national security. The value of homomorphic encryption is that it can enhance both privacy and security at the same time. IARPA's work in this area has built tools that are ready to use and could be tested against a variety of data, including education records, health records, census records, to test their degree of usability as well as the security guarantees they provide. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you. Carrie Cordero.
Thanks very much to the chairman and the board members for the invitation to join this first public forum of the newly reconstituted board. I'd like also to echo the special note of thanks to the former Chair Beth Collins and to the board's current and former professional staff for keeping it afloat during the lengthy period of uncertainty and delay. And I'm glad to see that the president has nominated and the Senate confirmed the 3 new board members, and look forward to the board reaching its full complement. The board's work is important both for the substance on which it engages and also for the transparency that it provides to the public. It has attained a valued role in the privacy community as well as the intelligence community, and those are not two distinct entities. Your board will be working with an intelligence community, as I think we heard from the prior remarks, that has taken significant steps forward in developing a network of privacy professionals inside the community. Having myself recently participated in the intelligence community's annual Privacy, Civil Liberties, and Transparency Conference, I feel comfortable in also reporting that the community has institutionalized the transparency initiatives that have been developed over the past 5+ years, and that they have continued despite changes in political leadership, which is exactly as it should be. In terms of the board's role, as you know, the previous iteration of the board was heavily invested in particular in 2 major bodies of work, the 215 program and the Section 702 acquisition. These were timely and valuable contributions to the public debate over surveillance authorities, but they were also after the fact reviews. They were reactionary. And so I'm hopeful that the next era of your work may permit the board to more regularly use 2 particular tools that are available in your toolkit. Those are first the advisory role, which Board Member Felton mentioned during his remarks. When at all possible, the board's engagement on the front end of collections using new technologies can be a productive use of the board's time. It's not as public-facing because it takes place more behind the scenes, but to any extent that you can get in on the front end of activities, particularly those that apply to new technologies affecting privacy interests, before the procedures are rolled out and before the workforce is trained on them, the better. Second, with respect to legislative consultation, one of the most important lessons from the scholarly and public reaction to the Snowden disclosures was that in addition to the need for greater transparency about interpretations of the law itself must be clear. And so I would encourage the board to look at proposed legislative activities in the terrorism space as to whether or not proposed legislative adjustments are only clear to those who have inside or classified knowledge of the activities, or whether they are too opaque even to the informed outside observer. These are questions that this board is well positioned to provide advice to the executive branch agencies and policymakers when requests for new authorities regarding counterterrorism activities are being drafted or proposed. As to the board's consideration of its substantive agenda going forward, I have the following thoughts for your consideration. I'd like to suggest that the board take under consideration the privacy implications of leaks and hacks, and that the board conduct oversight over the government's responsibilities, policies, procedures, and practices to secure private information obtained during counterterrorism investigations and work. Despite policies intended to address information safeguarding, we're all aware that there have been substantial leaks of classified information over the course of nearly a decade now. There were the Manning disclosures in 2010, Snowden in 2013. We've since seen leaks of highly sensitive tools that does not necessarily have as much of a privacy implication in terms of the tools, but it demonstrates some type of security weakness that I think is taking place in government. More broadly, not in the national security space, just as an example, the OPM hack exposed millions of Americans' information and demonstrated the weakness of a non-national security related government storage activity. Outside of government, obviously the 2016 activities demonstrated the release of many Americans' information, including the content of sensitive emails, and the private sector hacks and exposures have released all sorts of Americans' data. So the portrait that is emerging is one of Americans' data that is constantly not being protected in certain areas. And these persistent era of leaks and hacks presents a special challenges for the large collection of large volumes of data on Americans that are collected in the counterterrorism context, both international and domestic terrorism, given the board's mandate is not limited to one or the other. So databases containing large volumes of information should be reviewed for both the privacy nature of the information retained and the security measures that the intelligence community is applying, commensurate with the type of information and the risk of exposure. A corollary to the issue of looking at leaks and hacks from the perspective of security procedures and how they can be privacy enhancing, I would also encourage the board to take under its consideration retention periods of information that's collected in the counterterrorism context. And so in addition to security, a review of retention procedures and implementation, comparisons of retention periods for similar data that is collected across different agencies, review of those retention periods as they relate to consistency on the issue of privacy protections, things like age-off rules and procedures, and deletion rules and procedures, and whether or not data deletion is occurring as it is supposed to occur according to whatever rules and procedures are in place. In addition, with respect to the type of information that the board looks at, I would encourage you, much of the board's activities in the past have focused on FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act obtained data, which obviously has been of increased interest, but I would encourage you to also look beyond FISA obtained information, because FISA, I would argue, is perhaps the most regulated, highly overseen. There's a lot of internal government effort that is devoted to oversight and compliance. And so I think the board's work can also be valuable in looking at information obtained under other authorities, not just in the FISA regime. Finally, just a few quick words on the FISA reauthorizations that are coming up in December 2019. As has been mentioned earlier, I think, of course, the most relevant one for this board's consideration will be the Section 215 reauthorization and that debate. As I've noted, the important lesson of 2013 and the time beyond was that reasonably informed observers should understand what the law authorizes. The board could take a constructive role in the upcoming debate by reviewing how the USA Freedom Act amendments to the acquisition of call records has been implemented and determining whether there are any recommendations to amendments to the law if appropriate. If it turns out that there are any significant discrepancies between what the law appears to authorize and the way that is actually being implemented. Given that the collection of this information has been fully exposed publicly, there seems little upside at this point and significant downside in having any remaining ambiguities about how the law is being used. So thank you again for the opportunity to join you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Chris Calabrese, thanks. Chairman Klein, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT is a nonpartisan tech policy advocacy organization. We're dedicated to protecting civil liberties, human rights, including privacy, free speech, and access to information. We're really glad that you're holding this public hearing so quickly. We think it's appropriate to do continued oversight of counterterrorism operations, and we think this is a really powerful first step. As an initial matter, I just want to note that there are 2 outstanding nominees. We hope Congress will move quickly to authorize the other 2 nominees to the PCLOB. The second thing is that we hope that the public will realize that for all its good work, the PCLOB is not a panacea. It's a tiny agency, fewer than 20 people tasked with investigating an intelligence community comprised of 17 agencies, hundreds of thousands of employees and contractors. Its roughly $8 million budget pales in comparison to the $60 billion budget of the IC. It's crucial that other means of oversight, most notably the congressional committees, continue to remain vigilant. But with such limited resources, you'll have to pick your battles. Here are 4 that we hope you will pick. First, oversight of counterterrorism surveillance conducted under Executive Order 12333. Second, promoting disclosures related to reauthorization of Section 215. Third, investigating novel ways the intelligence community might acquire data sets from the private sector. And fourth, misuse of counterterrorism authorities to conduct domestic surveillance on advocates, such as Black Lives Matter. First, EO 12333. This executive order authorizes broad international surveillance for terrorism and other intelligence purposes, including bulk collection of information. It has been a key authority underlying some of the IC's most aggressive surveillance programs, including Co-Traveler, through which the U.S. captured billions of location updates daily from mobile phones around the world, and Muscular, through which the NSA intercepted all data transmitted between certain Google and Yahoo data centers outside the United States. PCLOB has already authorized 3 in-depth investigations of 12333 programs and completed 1. We hope that the PCLOB will declassify as many facts as possible related to these programs and release a public version of any report. Second, as the board is aware, Section 215 must be reauthorized by Congress by December 15th of this year. The board has played a crucial role in previous 215 and 702 debates by providing a common set of facts and debunking overbroad claims about the efficacy of these programs. PCLOB is really the only neutral referee who can establish the basic facts that are crucial to any policy debate. Of specific concern here is educating the public on the number of unique identifiers in the 215 call detail records program, how so few targets of that program could balloon into so many records. In 2017, 40 targets generated 534 million records. And finally, the mistake that caused the NSA to unlawfully collect records under this program. This information and a general assessment of the program's efficacy would give the public and Congress the ability to assess the need for the 215 authority and balance that against its privacy cost. Third, we hope the PCLOB will consider investigating whether the IC is exploiting new potential avenues to obtain data from the private sector. In recent weeks, we have seen stories of third parties gaining access to location information and improperly sharing it with entities like bounty hunters, or allowing access to government officials without proper documentation. We have also seen at least one company, Family Tree DNA, offer the FBI access to public parts of its database. Given the sensitivity of this information, it's appropriate to ask if others in the government, including the IC, may have accessed it without abiding by necessary protections, or whether, in fact, there are no appropriate protocols right now and some need to be developed. Fourth, we hope the PCLOB will investigate a crucial issue, allegations that the FBI is monitoring peaceful protest activities as acts of potential terrorism. The press has reported investigations by the FBI of Black Lives Matter, including creating the label of Black Identity Extremists, and investigating Keystone XL pipeline and climate change protesters. In addition, the administration has recently stood up a new national vetting center designed to facilitate information sharing to identify potential threats to national security, border security, homeland security, and public safety. Much of the information from this center comes from the collection of information from social media accounts. These types of investigations, using anti-terror authorities to investigate constitutionally protected activity and the potential for investigations based on political viewpoints, chills the exercise of First Amendment rights and is a misallocation of resources. It's precisely this type of overreach which concerns civil liberties advocates after 9/11 and that PCLOB was created to monitor. It's impossible from the outside to know whether these types of activities are happening. It just is. But they are so concerning and so potentially devastating to the rule of law that they rise to the level that the PCLOB must investigate them, must make determinations, and if there's no substance to these allegations, that would be a wonderful outcome, and the PCLOB can say that and provide an important data point to the public. If these allegations do have any basis in fact, they must be investigated thoroughly and full attention must be paid to them. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. As I said at the outside, we recognize the PCLOB was only recently reconstituted to a quorum, and that it has limited resources. CDT hopes that some of them can be dedicated to these crucial issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Abdo.
Thank you to the chairman and to the other members of the board and its staff for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. It's encouraging to see the board back in session. I want to focus my remarks on the one proposal that I made in my written submission, which is that the board should make it an explicit part of its agenda to narrow the gap between what the public believes the intelligence agencies are doing and what the intelligence agencies are in fact doing. That measure of transparency is necessary to an informed self-government and for the democratic legitimacy of the intelligence agencies themselves. Since the 1970s, oversight of the intelligence agencies in this country has been based upon a flawed premise. The premise was that we could fully entrust oversight of the agencies to our elected representatives because they had access to classified information and because they are ultimately accountable to the public. This premise was always flawed, but the Snowden revelations revealed it to be so in dramatic fashion. We learned from those revelations that in secret, the authorities and activities of the intelligence agencies had far outrun public understanding and expectations. The revelations showed that secret oversight is not sufficient to maintain the connection between the consent of the governed and the conduct of the governing. The result has been lasting damage to the legitimacy of the intelligence agencies and more broadly to public faith in government. The lesson of those disclosures is that some measure of transparency is necessary to ensure that the public understands, in at least general terms, the legal authorities of the intelligence agencies and the activities said to be justified by those authorities. Absent that level of transparency, gaps will inevitably develop between the agency's authorities on the one hand and the public's understanding of them on the other. And those gaps are corrosive. They deny the public the information the public needs to understand what the government is doing. And in doing so, these gaps undermine democratic self-government. They deprive the intelligence agencies' activities of democratic legitimacy, and they fuel distrust of the agencies themselves. This is where I think the board fits in. Historically, the intelligence agencies have not shown the ability to fairly balance the interests of secrecy and transparency. Perhaps for understandable reasons, they tend to overestimate the risks of disclosure of certain information, and they tend to underestimate the harms to our democracy of failing to disclose other information that the public needs. That's probably due in no small part to the fact that incentives within government tilt almost all in one direction towards secrecy. Officials risk punishment for disclosing information that will cause harm, but not for suppressing information whose disclosure would be in the public interest. It's heartening to hear today the commitment of the intelligence community toward new transparency, and I take seriously the comments from the last panelist, Mr. Joel, that the intelligence community is making efforts to improve transparency. Notwithstanding those recent efforts, there still is not enough. And I want to give just a couple of examples to explain tangibly why, notwithstanding a new commitment, at least in theory, to transparency, the board can play a valuable role here. We still don't know, for example, the number of Americans' communications swept up in foreign intelligence surveillance that is nominally directed abroad at foreigners. We don't know the extent of surveillance that happens under 12333, which is the intelligence community's most significant source of legal authority. We don't know any of the nature of the bulk surveillance purportedly taking place under that authority. We don't know the extent to which Americans' communications are swept up under that authority. And it's worthwhile to compare that level of transparency with the level of transparency, for example, that the UK has fostered around some of its surveillance practices. So, for example, the United Kingdom has disclosed about its analog to Section 702 significant detail that allows the public to understand how, in fact, the analog to 702 surveillance in the UK operates. Compare that here toward what appear to be games played by the intelligence community in disclosing basic facts about the operation of 702. It is, for example, the official position of the Department of Justice and the intelligence community that it is a classified fact whether Section 702 is used to monitor web traffic on the internet. That's shocking. That level of secrecy seems to be designed not to prevent the disclosure of information that would in fact cause harm to the public, but designed to avoid public accountability and, at least in some specific instances, designed to avoid judicial review by Article III courts other than the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The board, on the other hand, I think is uniquely well positioned to push for transparency. It has both the access needed to understand the risks of disclosure and the independence needed to understand the risks to our democracy of the failure to disclose. And the board has a pretty good track record on this score. In the Section 702 report, it was proud to announce that it had pushed for the declassification of 100 additional facts, and I think the board is to be commended for that effort. And because of that unique advantage, I think the board has a crucial role to play in striking the right balance between secrecy and transparency. The board should embrace that role. It should make transparency a key aim of its work. In every area of its oversight, it should push for declassification of the information necessary for the public to understand what the intelligence agencies are doing. Now, I appreciate the board's commitment to transparency as well, and not just the commitment of the intelligence community. I think the chairman spoke eloquently of the importance of transparency, not only to the legitimacy of the board's work, but to the legitimacy of the intelligence agencies. My concern is this. What has allowed the board to operate so far in relative transparency was, I think, an aberration. It was the significant disclosures made by the intelligence community following the Snowden revelations. Since those revelations, however, we have learned comparatively little new about how the intelligence agencies operate, the extent of the legal authorities on which they primarily rely, and the consequences of the surveillance programs operating under those authorities on Americans' privacy. If the board does not take an active role in pushing for new declassification of information about those topics and others, then I fear that the board's work in the future will largely be behind closed doors and in secret. And if that ends up being the case, then I think it'll be an enormous missed opportunity for the board to serve as an effective and independent overseer of the intelligence community. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now have some questions from the board members, and then we will shift to questions from the public.
Several of you mentioned, and Alex Joel also mentioned, issues related to the proliferation of connected devices and data. Internet of Things, connected devices, and the existence of large amounts of data about people in databases. And Alex Joel talked about how about how terrorists might attempt to exploit that situation. But how more broadly might we think about the connection between the risks associated with large collections of data and the Internet of Things and the mission of protecting the nation against terrorism and the civil liberties and privacy implications?
I mean, so obviously connected devices, just to pick one category, are tremendously personal. Many of them are in the home. They're in the sort of most intimate and private places in our lives. And to the extent that it is possible to ascertain the location of devices, it should, we should be able to draw very sharp distinctions between foreign intelligence collection and impermissible collection in a domestic context. So that's one area. I think in terms of the large amounts of data that we're seeing, I would go back to some of the things that Jason has sort of promoted in his remarks. I do think that there are technical fixes that will allow us to engage with larger data sets in a way that's more privacy protective and pursue them. I'm going to take this opportunity, Carrie, to gently push back on something you said too, which is the suggestion that the board spend more time investigating the security issues that come with securing large data sets. Well, I agree they're incredibly important and vital privacy issues. I think there's a lot of people in the government who are worried about those issues and have a lot of expertise aimed at fixing security issues. I think the board's time would probably be better spent on its own unique, the needs that only the board can fill.
I agree with, sorry, Carrie.
Well, so I'll sort of answer Ed's question and then Chairman Felton's question, or Board Member Felton, sorry. I just promoted. Let me answer the question and also sort of respond to your comment as well. So I think one way that the board could approach your question is to be looking at the types of information that are collected through all these different means, including IoT and the large data sets. And the first question is, what of these data sets actually has the information that is of privacy concern? So there's a lot of information the government might be collecting in its counterterrorism responsibilities that might not have heightened privacy interests. And I think the challenge for the board will be to identify the types of information that the government is collecting that actually have the higher levels of privacy interest. So I think that's one way to approach it. Just to follow up on your point, the reason that I raise the security issue, and even though you mentioned, Chris, that there's a lot of other people in government doing it, I am not yet convinced, now that I've been on the outside for a long time, I'm not yet convinced that the government entities or persons responsible for doing the security of the data collected in the national security space are necessarily looking at it from a privacy perspective. In other words, if we're collecting, if the government is collecting large volumes of data that is of heightened privacy interest, where I view things having changed over the last 5 to 10 years is that that data being exposed are higher. We haven't yet seen mass exposures of the highest levels of private data. So for example, we haven't yet seen exposure of the content of repositories of data that's acquired under national security authorities, but that would be the type of information that I would be most concerned about. And I would suggest that the board might take that under advisement to be looking at it from a privacy perspective, because time spent looking at those security measures on the front end could be valuable.
And I would just say, so I agree with that as well, and I think the board would be well suited to look at things like retention schedules. I do think that kind of balancing act is certainly information you don't have, you can't leak, it can't be disclosed, and that would be a valuable piece.
I just had one small point, but I think an important one, which is that the proliferation of network-connected devices is an area where the board can ensure that the intelligence agencies are not just viewing a possible avenue of surveillance as an opportunity, but as a risk, and can fulfill their other mandate, the defensive mandate of securing important infrastructure against vulnerabilities that leave us all at risk of surveillance, not just by U.S. law enforcement and intelligence authorities, but foreign ones and malicious actors as well.
So, if I could jump in here, several of you mentioned the FISA sunsets that are coming up in 2019, and of course, most prominently within those 215 authorities. But I wonder, with respect to the other authorities that are at stake, so for example, the lone wolf provision, if you have thoughts on which ones you'd like to see more attention and debate on, and in particular, whether you'd like to see the board taking a sort of more active role in considering some of those authorities.
So, I mean, I would just say, I think that it's very hard from the outside to know what particular programs are about, we should be evaluating, to look for the gaps. I would guess I would just encourage the board to generally make an evaluation about programs where it believes that more attention needs to be paid. So, and it can do that through, for example, laying out an oversight agenda and saying that we are publicly going to look at these things, and sort of leaving some breadcrumbs whereby, you know, we on the outside can say, oh, okay, these are programs I guess that we should be paying attention to as well. And then, you know, on the back end, being able to really, without necessarily having to disclose, you know, the facts, though obviously as many facts as you can bring to the public light would be wonderful, but just evaluations about programs that are effective or programs that you believe Congress needs to spend more attention to because they may not strike the right balance between privacy and the security value.
I would also add that if there are 3 provisions that are up for sunset, as I understand, one is the Section 215. If I was to rank them in terms of which of the provisions I think would be a good use of the board's time, I would put the Section 215 renewal highly on top of the list. Much farther below that would be the roving wiretap authority that's up for renewal, which that's such a widely used authority on the criminal investigative side that I don't think it ranks even close to the 215 issue, given interest in that before. And then very far below that would be the lone wolf provision, which I don't really think raises significant issues for the board.
I think I agree with both those comments. Maybe just add another way of thinking about the role of the board when it comes to periods of, sunset periods or reform periods. It wouldn't be a bad idea for the board to study the various reform proposals and to focus on pushing for transparency of information necessary for the public to understand the basis for a particular reform proposal and why the public might or might not support that particular reform proposal, as opposed to what's going on in the status quo. It's often very difficult for the public to understand why some senator with access to classified information is proposing one reform without a baseline of information to understand how the authorities are being used. I think that could be an area where the board could fulfill a very important function.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly respond to a few points that were made by our panelists. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Calabrese for expressing his support for our nominees. We are looking forward to having our two nominees hopefully join the board relatively soon. On the advice function, with Ms. Bordero mentioned, I think it's helpful on our part to offer a bit of transparency today as well. We are generally not able to disclose the topics of advice projects. However, we can say that the new board has voted to accept several advice projects already pursuant to that function. And we have been authorized to say publicly that the board has provided advice on every major revision by an intelligence community component of its guidelines for handling U.S. person information required by Executive Order 12333, which was mentioned earlier. So those are two areas in which the board has been active. One other is the procedures for handling raw signals intelligence information, also under Executive Order 12333, that were issued, I believe, in early 2017 or late 2016 by the intelligence community. The board also has publicly disclosed that it provided advice on that. And so we consider that a very important pillar of our statutory authorities as well. I have a question for Jason Matheny. Could you prioritize one or two privacy-enhancing technologies and one or two potentially privacy-eroding technologies from among the list that you offered that would fall within the board's jurisdiction that would be most relevant for us to consider?
Sure. On privacy enhancing, the highest priority I would assign to developments in homomorphic encryption, and particularly partially homomorphic encryption methods that already exist, that are practical for a range of applications, including intelligence applications, but also a number of other applications throughout society. Those are ready, really, to be used. I would also prioritize, as in places 2 and 3, differential privacy techniques, to adding noise to data sets that make it harder to de-anonymize. And then third, techniques that can protect the privacy of data that are used for machine learning. It turns out that there are a number of vulnerabilities to machine learning systems for sort of privacy attacks that were recently discovered. And it was humbling to discover those. And now we're scrambling really to patch the security of those systems. I think that's an area that really deserves a lot of attention. On the side of technologies that that can decrease privacy, I think the proliferation of biometric identification systems is something that the United States won't have a whole lot of control over. And there are many legitimate uses for such systems, and there are also, of course, malicious uses of such systems. I think in the applications in the United States, in terms of law enforcement and intelligence, we should ensure that there are standards for privacy that include encryption standards for biometric data that companies as well as agencies should adhere to.
Thank you. Board members Felton and Nitza, do you have any further questions, or should we invite the public at this point? Okay, great. And Alex, Joel, can we call you back up, and can we find a place for Mr. Joel to?
We have to give him a bite, too.
You have to share.
We're going to tweet the 4 rays so you'll love
And we have a stand-up microphone here in the front, and so if you have a question, please approach the microphone and line up. Otherwise, we board members can monopolize the questioning for the rest of the hour. Give you all a few moments to cogitate. Okay, well, I'm happy to ask another question then. It's about artificial intelligence and its applications, potentially by the government. If you all would each potentially address, and obviously our technologists, but also those of you working on privacy and civil liberties, how your organizations assess that and how you think the board can most usefully contribute, both in terms of oversight, but also potentially in terms of convening and public outreach.
Well, so CDT has long been concerned about the use of artificial. Actually, I shouldn't say. I don't want to lead with concern. Artificial intelligence is a wonderful tool. There's a variety of things you can do with it that are awesome and exciting, and so the board, we wouldn't want to lead with that it's bad, but I do think that there are a variety of ways that digital decisions can be made that are harmful to individuals, and it can sometimes be difficult to understand how that harm would happen because those decisions are opaque. So at CDT, what we have suggested is, and we have a sort of a decision, a tool that allows the private sector to do this that I believe would also be applicable in the government sector, which is essentially to interrogate the development of machine learning systems, whereby at each stage of the process, so the collection of data, the creating, the initial theory about what you're solving for, the testing of the system, you ask specific questions about what types of data are being used, what might be missing, are there groups that are over or undersampled or represented in those systems, and then that sort of system-based approach allows you to essentially look at the systems as they're being developed and see if you can identify some of those blind spots, at the outset. And then, of course, afterwards, after the algorithm is in the wild, there are a tremendous number of efforts underway right now to begin to think about how to audit those systems and use them in ways that make sure that they don't discriminate on the basis of a protected class or come to a result that would be either improper or unexpected in a way that harms an individual.
I guess I would say I have a couple of primary concerns about artificial intelligence as used by the intelligence agencies. Maybe my overriding one is that the capabilities of artificial intelligence are going to fuel, to the extent they're not already fueling, a voracious appetite for more data. Artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms work to the extent they do because they train on enormous volumes of data. And as we saw in the Section 215 debate, future analysis sometimes is used to legally justify initial collection. And to the extent that that's taking place with respect to artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithms, I think we should be troubled by it and question question the decision to collect information for that sort of analysis. The second concern would be the extent to which we can learn or discern information from enormous volumes of data that the public wouldn't expect intelligence agencies to be able to learn from that data. And here I think one of the most important things is for the public just to understand what is revealed or what can be discerned from large volumes of data. And then the third, this I think most closely echoes Chris's comment, is ensuring that machine learning algorithms do not in their predictions reflect the biases of the training data. That's a problem in publicly studied machine learning algorithms, and there's no reason to think that the intelligence agencies have some special sauce in their implementation of machine learning algorithms that would avoid those pitfalls. And so it's important that the intelligence agencies audit their systems for that possibility, and the board could play an important role there.
So I'll just say that those, I agree completely with the concerns that were expressed just now in terms of the getting out in the wild phrase. It's a phrase I've used myself a number of times to talk about the risk that I was thinking more in terms of a series of results coming out of a computer program, but it could also be the algorithm itself, leaving the contained confines of the expert user and going out into a broader group of folks who don't understand the constraints that ought to be placed on the validity and accuracy of the results. The issue of more voracious appetite for data is, I think of it as the feed the beast issue. So you create this beast that can only want more and more data in order to be more accurate, and that's not wrong. It's not wrong. So the more data you give to certain programs, it will get more accurate results, but you do have to worry about making sure you have the proper authorities and making sure you're doing it properly, etc. We've also mentioned the need to understand what's going on with the algorithm, that doesn't, and I think both of you talked about not reflecting inherent biases. So all of those things are issues that we've been thinking about. We don't have all the answers, but we've been thinking about them. DARPA has a research project on transparency for artificial intelligence, which I think is going to be very important, to try to make sure that the user understands how the machine reached a conclusion, made a decision, what was its process, because right now sometimes it seems like just magic happening inside the box. The other thing I'll say is that the private sector is going at this, with great innovation, great energy, great vigor, moving ahead by leaps and bounds. The government is taking a more deliberate approach, but to the extent there are concerns about artificial intelligence and machine learning, many of these concerns apply to all uses of it, including in the private sector. So I do think it's an important conversation that the entire nation has to have in terms of how we do this. And I know that different developers in the private sector are thinking about ethics of how they constrain and provide transparency about the use of these tools.
So a couple thoughts. First, I would just encourage the board, not to say that you're not, but to think about this as a present issue, not a future issue. There was a recent CRS report, so publicly available information that I came across in doing some research recently that included the fact that in one intelligence community element alone, there were, I think it was well over 100 ongoing AI-related projects. So I would very much encourage you to think about this as a current issue that is currently requiring attention to the civil liberties and privacy implications of the intelligence community's use of these technologies, not something that is over the horizon. The second issue that I think AI presents when it's applied to intelligence work in particular is actually related to the retention issues that I described earlier. In that, and I think Alex was getting to this a little bit, my understanding, and I defer to the technologists on this, but my understanding at a sort of layperson's perspective is that the more information that is provided to the machine learning, the more effective it will be. That is inverse to the concept that I propose to you, which is that you should be looking at retention periods and potentially limiting them, given the looking at procedures and being more scrutinizing of retention periods, given the risks of leaks and exposures in our present time. So I tend to think that those two things will be in tension with one another, and just raise that as an issue for your consideration.
So AI techniques can be used to decrease privacy. For example, facial recognition systems and de-anonymization techniques. They can also be used, though, to increase privacy, for example, by reducing the need for humans to view individual data, and even by providing certain kind of information theoretic guarantees on the security of data. Understanding AI's impacts on privacy is among the key issues for the AI Commission that I serve on, and I'd be happy to recommend references and experts who can provide deep dives on the topic, including more references to Alice and Bob.
Can I add one small comment, and I'd love to hear Jason's response to this if I'm getting this wrong, but it's a response in part to what Chris and Alex said about the prospect of machine learning algorithms escaping into the wild. My understanding is that as a general matter in the field of machine learning, what tends to be most proprietary is not the machine learning algorithm itself, but the training data. And that what the intelligence agencies will have special access to when it comes to machine learning is not some mathematical corner on machine learning algorithms, but on the data they're using to train it. And so it may be that there is an opportunity for transparency about the algorithms themselves being used, even if not the specific coefficients of the variables used in any particular algorithm, so that the public can understand in general terms what algorithms are being used, what the flaws are in those algorithms or the mathematical deficiencies in understanding of those algorithms, even if that wouldn't involve releasing the data that the intelligence agencies are using to train those algorithms. I'd love to hear if that's right. I'd love to be confronted if wrong. I'd love to know too.
So I think that the way in which companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon are able to attract top AI talent is by allowing them to continue to publish their algorithmic advances, and those companies retain their competitive advantage because they're not publishing the billions of data points that are used to train those models. So in general, I agree that models or algorithms are in general fairly open, both in the academic community and the industrial community, as well as in government, which often publishes the algorithms that are being used.
Okay. I just it occurred to me also to mention that AI has significant potential. I understand I'm not an expert on this in terms of assisting with transparency and classification and declassification, and assisting people who are charged with reviewing large volumes of information to respond to different declassification mandates and transparency requests, to hopefully help make that process faster and more consistent. So we're very hopeful in that regard.
Okay, I'll go next, I guess. Jason Matheny noted that the role of encryption in enhancing privacy. But at the same time, there have been calls for policy steps to create increased data access, such as efforts to address the going dark issue. How might we think about encryption and the role that it might play with respect to the PCLOB mission?
going to sound very repetitive here. It seems very unlikely to me that the PCLOB is going to resolve the debate for the country about whether law enforcement and the intelligence agency should have exceptional access to encrypted communications. But I think they can further that debate significantly by looking behind claims made by law enforcement and intelligence agencies that, on balance, it would be better for the country to have access to those communications rather than for the country to be able to rely on the security that end-to-end encryption provides. And I think that element of transparency would go a long way toward helping the public have a meaningful debate about that topic.
And I would sort of echo that by noting that obviously the NSA has two missions, one of which is information protection. And to the extent that the board is able to lift up voices within the agency that are able to talk, even if it's not publicly, about the value that encryption provides as a security measure, I think that sort of informal either project or sort of connection, it would be really important in educating policymakers on the reality of the value of encryption.
Board Member Nitze?
Sure. I'd be curious if some panelists could speak to, in some cases speak to it, in some cases speak more to the use by the government of open source information. So for example, as Mr. Abdo has stated in his prepared remarks, the National Vetting Center has spoken of its access and use of social media. And I wonder if you or your organization has views on how we should approach these issues.
Cautiously. I think one thing that remains to be seen is how courts apply the Carpenter decision, which held that the government's long-term collection of nominally public data implicated the Fourth Amendment, how they apply that decision to other data sets. And there are no decisions applying Carpenter to the intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies may very well have different arguments about their entitlement to rely on nominally open data, and collecting it in a large scale. To what extent the board should be involved, I think it should analyze the extent to which that is happening, the extent to which there may be arguments that the Carpenter decision should apply to that collection, and it should, to the extent it can, help inform the public about what sort of collection is taking place on the basis of what legal theory, so that the public and legislators can evaluate the authorities and activities of the intelligence agencies.
I would also encourage them encourage them to dig deeply into the efficacy of these programs. It's not at all clear that the collection of lots of information from a public social media account is a useful tool for evaluating whether someone is in fact a threat. And to the extent that we're simply taking that as a given, I think we've missed a really important step in the process, which is before you invade people's privacy, especially on this kind of massive scale, you really should be doing it for a good reason and for, with a basis that you think that there's a security value. At least I certainly have not seen anything from the agencies that gives me confidence that that's the case, and in fact, kind of the opposite.
So I know Jason, from his IARPA days, has some thoughts, I think, on this. But just quickly, I do think this is a helpful area for the board to work on. We publish guidance on how to properly obtain and use publicly available information, but that guidance, it's out there on the internet, but that guidance is now several years old. Actually, it was issued in 2011, I believe, so we need to look at it to make sure it's updated. The basic principles, I think, are good ones. We do worry about collecting information because of First Amendment protections to that data. We worry that it is truly publicly available, as in available to any member of the public, and not something you have to have a password for or be a friend, quote unquote, or part of someone's accepted social network to obtain. And we do worry about the accuracy and efficacy, as Chris pointed out. There's, of course, sometimes where it's completely irrelevant. We also provided some guidance on use of social media in the context of background investigations, where we try to build in some protections. But I think that the intelligence community certainly looks at open source information as a valuable source of intelligence, and you can think of any number of events that took place overseas where the ability to look at publicly available information was critical to rounding out the picture of how we understood those events and how we prepared intelligence for policymakers. And Jason.
So one study that we funded at IERPA looking at the value of open source information found that very often analysis based on open source data was more accurate, more timely, and substantially more cost effective than analysis based on classified data. So just in order to improve our picture of the world as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and I think as safely as possible, I would discourage, too much restriction on the use of open source data. In fact, I think right now open source analysts are in many ways very handicapped in analyzing those data. You'll see open source analysts who are literally in the parking lots of their offices trying to acquire open source data in order to perform their jobs because it's so difficult within the intelligence community to have ready access.
I would add that Alex and Jason's remarks are tailored specifically, and Alex said here earlier that he's only representing the intelligence community because the board's mandate includes the ability to look at the privacy implications of both international terrorism and domestic terrorism, that to the extent the board is going to be looking at the implications of open source collection, that the board makes sure to include the non-intelligence community elements that might be collecting this type of information. So most likely, I think DHS would be the most likely entity that might collect information that would be terrorism relevant, but not falling under the rule. Most of it does not fall under the rules and procedures that the intelligence community does.
And if I could just clarify one thing, I don't want to mix apples and oranges, and I think a little bit of some of what we've seen with the National Vetting Center, for example, is a little bit of a different beast than some of the other types of open source collection we might be talking about. I think using social media to make particularized determinations about somebody, whether somebody is dangerous or should be allowed into the United States, is very much nascent and it's not at all clear that's going to be an effective practice. That's a little different than the use of general open source information in a variety of topics. So I just want to make sure we understand. I'm clearly communicating that distinction.
Can I speak about one small thing that Alex said? I was happy to hear him mention the First Amendment, and there are about a dozen statutes and regulations, at least that I know of, that include a First Amendment constraint on surveillance, but they tend to be fairly narrow in their prohibition. They almost always include the word solely. The relevant agency may not use that surveillance authority solely on the basis of activity protected by the First Amendment. And very little is known publicly about how those restrictions are interpreted and applied, and especially in the context of acquisition of open source information like social media data, it would be very helpful to understand how those prohibitions interact with the threshold determination of whether to pull in certain social media data.
Board Member Nitsa, do you have anything else?
Thank you.
Well, they say that the greatest gift you can give someone is time, so we will give you the gift of 10 minutes of your time back unexpectedly. If neither of you has any closing comments, then I will make a few. I want to thank everyone here for attending today. The interest of the public is a great asset to our board, and it's also an important part of our mission. We will be opening a docket on the Federal Register, hopefully in the coming days, to enable anyone who has ideas for us to submit those to the board through official channels, and they will become part of the record. I particularly want to thank the 5 experts who offered their insights today. This was refreshing, thought-provoking, very informative. I think it's worth noting that the panel reflects both sides of the board's mission, recognition of the need for efforts to protect the nation against terrorism, and also respect for the professionals who are carrying out that mission, but also the healthy skepticism of government power that is built into our constitutional order and our legal system. And it is our job to balance and reconcile those things in an intelligent way, and you have helped us immensely in doing that. I also want to recognize our staff members who worked very hard at pulling this event together. As Chris pointed out, it is a small group, but they are a great group. As you can see, their creativity in getting board member Nitsa online and visible to us today. So thank you for that. I'll just close by saying that this is going to be the first of a series of events held on a regular schedule. We think this is very important to do. And so we look forward to seeing many of you at those events in the future. Thanks again.